When we're talking about multi-effects pedals, meaning pedals that have multiple different effects under one roof, whether that's delay, modulation, reverb, etc., usually the Mount Rushmore of today's pedal manufacturers are going to be people like Strymon, the Line 6 HX and Helix series. Maybe Source Audio would be in that conversation as well, as having some of the most popular multi-effects pedals that are out there. But there's one particular multi-effects that came out almost 20 years ago, but is still the most widely used multi-effect pedal by the most prolific session musicians out there, from LA to Nashville. And it's nothing else other than the Line 6 M9. And today we're going to talk about why this is still such a great device, why some of the most influential and prolific session musicians still use this pedal, and the reason why they do, not only sonically but functionally. And we're going to get into some of the tones that this creates in recreating some of the signature tones used by some of its most well-known users in the session musician scene. Let's get into it, a deep dive into why the Line 6 M9 is still one of the greatest multi-effects pedals ever made. So if you've never heard of the Line 6 M9, it sort of emanated from a line of multi-effects that were more effect specific. And by that I mean Line 6 used to make a green delay called the DL4, and they had other 4 series emulators that would take a specific type of effect, whether that's delay or whether that's distortion or whether that's modulation, and they would encompass all those things into one box. And many of the people that actually work for Strymon now were on those projects. So you can see in the development of the timeline and the Mobius that these sorts of footprints or archetypes kind of held true into the Strymon era when those Line 6 employees migrated and created their own companies and started to do sort of all-in-one multi-effects for specific types of effects. Now, the M9 is sort of a spin-off of what they were doing in those things like the DL4 and MM4, and basically put all those effects under one roof, and then you have 6 foot switches where you could assign different effects to each one of those switches that you can access at any time. Now, this by most people's standard is not considered to be of the same level of the processing of today's multi-effects like the Strymon and the Helix. Again, just another Line 6 product that's been developed for, today's standards with all of the processing power of what's available with today's technology. But for some reason, session musicians, whether we're talking about Tim Pierce, who's one of the most prolific LA session musicians, or we're talking about Tom Bukovac in Nashville, or Kenny Greenberg, or Derek Wells, or Jerry McPherson, these guys are all people that invariably you've heard on hit recording after hit recording, whether it's pop charts, whether it's country charts, and they're invariably all using this M9. So likely if you've heard a delay, a reverb, a modulation effect, you're most likely hearing an M9 if you're talking about popular music or music that's on the radio, because all these players are using this effect on their pedal board. Now, there's a reason that they don't go for the latest and greatest effects, even by the same maker, Line 6, or by Strymon and some of these other multi-effects companies. And there's one primary reason why. And it comes down to really 2 things: simplicity and it sounds great. Now, I know a lot of people have a lot of bad things to say about the M9 in terms of its reliability. I know that a lot of people talk about the DSP quality and the processing power not being equivalent to what's available today, so it just doesn't have the fidelity. And I know that some people complain about the analog drive-through issue, where that's going to create some sort of latency. But I actually spoke with Tom Bukovac, who's one of the biggest users and proponents of the M9, and likely one of the people that has used it the most on hit records, whether that's with Keith Urban or any of the hundreds of thousands of different artists that he's worked with over his career, to really talk about why he still chooses this, what he likes about it, the sounds that he goes after. And he also addresses some of those questions about latency, where some people think that maybe there is going to be some problem with that because it doesn't have the analog drive-through. He's going to talk about the reliability, but moreover talk about why he uses this thing. Let's go over to Tom Bukovac, aka Uncle Larry. Let's see what he has to say.
Why do I still use the Line 6 M9? I was probably one of the last guys in Nashville to actually start using that thing. I mean, I remember seeing it on everybody's board. I just thought, how good can this thing be, right? But I kept seeing all these guys using it, right? Hell, I mean, I remember doing a session one time with Jerry McPherson, and he dialed up some really cool sound, and I was like, dude, what is that? How'd you do that? And he's like, M9, and I was like, well, shit, I got to try one. And I was expecting it to be some complicated piece of gear that's way above my head, because most things are. I was expecting this piece to be the same. I thought I would get one, try it, and then hate it because it was too complicated. But quite the opposite. Without even looking at the manual, I pulled the thing out of the box, I remember, and it was so easy to use. I figured it out in 2 seconds. And then you just turn it to what you want, and then you don't have to store anything. It just leaves it where it was. That's the kind of shit I'm talking about. And then I started thinking, well, some of these, effects sound pretty good, like the phasers and things, and I had, at the time, I had all the original pedals that the thing was modeling, right? So I was just occasionally would just compare them, and I thought, I'm not going to say it sounds better than an old Phase 90 script logo or something, but it's good enough, man, where it's like you can get by a lot of the times, and I rarely, like what I mainly use it for is like the spring reverb and the delays and the occasional chorus, maybe the occasional phase or flange. It takes the place of a lot of shit that you would have to have on your board, If it only did the delays that it does and the spring reverbs that it does, it would be worth it. But it does so much more than that. And if I was going to do like a real heavy duty Waylon Jennings thing, I would probably bust out my real Phase 90. Mm-hmm. It's a little cooler sounding. But man, when you're in a pinch, you need a phaser. It works. I think it's a great pedal. I mean, the low res delay, the analog delay with mod is great.
Yeah, it's kind of supposed to be a memory man.
Yeah, man, it sounds great.
Are you using it in mono or stereo ordinarily?
Both. Sometimes mono, sometimes stereo. And it's great in stereo. I use a couple of the fuzzes in there once in a while. That buzzsaw is pretty good. And okay. I like the, what's the one called? Facial fuzz. I'm down with that. The particle reverb is good. You ever try that? The particle verb? That's nice.
Okay. Yeah, I stick to the 63 tube. The belief is that there's some latency because the analog signal is not maintained from the input to the output. But I've told people if they really were that concerned, you could, I guess, put it in a mixer, in your pedal board, and then there's your analog drive. But I've tried that with it, and it didn't really seem to make much of a difference, other than I just had to increase the mix a lot so that it would be more the way that it would have been if I just put it in series with everything else.
I'm really sensitive to latency when I work with people that have like even the slightest glitch in their Pro Tools and stuff. I've never noticed any latency.
Now, as you can hear, not only does Tom, aka Uncle Larry, say that there is no latency that's detectable with his sensitive ears, and not only is it something that really sounds great, but it's something that really makes it easy for him to recall any preset that he wants. It's available as far as an effect inside of this. He has one knob to find whatever that is that he wants in terms of the effect, and then he has 5 controls to adjust whatever that effect is to his desired tone. This is not so easy in some of the menus that are available out there for a lot of the multi-effects pedals, especially things that do as many different effects as the M9. So this is in essence creating an effects pedal that you can dial in with real knobs and on an individual foot switch. So you basically have as close to the semblance of an individual pedal on a pedal board as possible to make those changes on a fly. So if a producer says to you, yeah, I really like that take, but I really wish it had some chorus that was a little more modulated, or I wish you added some phaser to that, you can easily go down here and find it, dial it in. And again, just like Tom said, maybe it's not as good as using a Phase 90 on a Waylon Jennings tune, but it's passable, sounds really good, and this takes the place of multiple pedals on your pedal board, so you can sort of augment this with some other overdrive and distortion pedals and maybe some of your key pedals that are always being used, and then this can kind of represent a lot of the pedals du jour, in addition to some really great tones, whether that's reverb, whether that's delay, whether that's chorus. And so I'm going to dial up some of those sounds now along the lines of what Tom was saying were some of his favorites inside of the M9, and I'm going to see what I can come up with to get some nice tones. I'm going to be using my Telecaster here. I'm going to be using the clean channel of a Soldano SLO100, and I'm going to be running the M9 right in front of it. I'm not going to use any other effects, just guitar into M9, M9 into the front of the Soldano clean, and we're going to dial up some cool effects, again using the preferred effects of Uncle Larry, aka Tom Bukovac. Let's check it out. So first, I just want to go with that classic spring reverb. This is something that I like to use on it, and this is also something that Tom pretty much uses all the time on the M9, using that 63 spring reverb sound. So let's dial in a little tone here. Let's see how this thing sounds. I think that sounded great. Obviously, the Soldano SLO doesn't have any sort of reverb sound. We're using it clean, so it's not exactly the full capability that you would use, but I think that this is kind of a pretty vanilla, clean sound on this amp that doesn't really add much character. It's kind of a neutral, more flat, maybe a little bit more on the scooped end for clean tones. But I think that this reverb sounds absolutely great into it. But let's go with something a little bit more complex. I'm going to dial in a little bit more of an ambient tone here. I'm going to be using a little bit of the particle reverb, which is another one that Tom likes. I'm going to use a little bit of analog delay with modulation, which I think is kind of representing that deluxe Memory Man type sound. And let's see what happens. Let's do it. That sounded great. I really like the tones that we were getting here. I want to go a little further, add in a little phaser, which is something that Tom always talked about using. Again, and kind of using that Waylon Jennings example where, you know, he could dial this up in a pinch to kind of do some of those phase 90 sounds. So I'm going to dial in a little bit of that. I'm going to play a little, you know, kind of Doobie Brothers inspired, listen to the music type thing, and maybe make it a little bit more processed than you might have heard on the original record. Just kind of do a little interpretation of that. Let's see how it sounds with a little bit of phaser added in there. Awesome. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually dial in a little low res delay, and I'm going to mix that with some chorus and a little bit of the particle reverb, and just kind of have that on a little lightly and just see what that does, just to do some nice textural stuff again, just kind of play something with a little bit more space and really see what happens. I love what that does. It still sounds nice and warm, and really I think that when I go to that low res delay, it has a lot of those features that we see maybe more of the hipster delay is getting these days, and really does it, I think, quite well. I want to do another textural piece here and go to the analog with mod again, kind of that analog Memory Man type sound, and add in a little bit more processing on this with a little bit of the 63 reverb, and then adding in a little bit of the chorus sound here, just on a subtle chorus, and just do a little bit more textural stuff and just see how that sounds, because I really feel like it's excelling at a lot of those bigger, more spatial type delays, and those are a lot of times the delays that people maybe complain that don't sound as analog or as warm, and maybe a byproduct of not having some of the processing power or the fidelity of the newer delays sort of maybe gives us a little bit more of an analog dimension, even though it's a fully digital device. Let's do that one. Let's see how it sounds. So I think all in all, if we're talking about the M9, I have to say I'm really impressed with the tone that it's producing. I have a couple of original Memory Mans, not only original ones from the 80s, but I also have some from the 90s that are reissues, all with those MN3005 chips, and so I'm pretty attuned to how it's supposed to sound. And I have to say, for the analog with mod, to me that's definitely a winner. It very much sounds the part, it sounds really warm, really lush, and has a lot of those original characteristics that we all know and love from that effect. Equally, the 63 reverb to me sounds absolutely great as a spring reverb, and I have to say for a multi-effect, it's up there with any of the good ones that you would have known or that people would talk about in terms of great spring reverb emulating pedals that are digital. Also, I think some of those sort of, again, more hipster effects, as I'm calling them, with more of that particle reverb and that low-res delay, I think those sound really great for those big ambient things where you just want to create a lot of space and texture and just kind of have a little shimmer and a little something extra to the sound. The chorus to me still sounded pretty dang good. I mean, it's maybe not as good as my CE2, but it definitely very much sounds like a nice warm analog chorus. And then I think the phaser, you know, it's not a phase 90, but I think for what it is, it sounds really good. You can of course add in extra stages to that chorus and even get some more intense sounds, some different sounds than what would ordinarily be associated with just a single phase 90. I think all in all, those settings that Tom has given me and that I've kind of dialed up here based on his recommendation, I think that they sound absolutely wonderful, and I can't see why this doesn't still work or couldn't still work on your own rig if you're interested in diving into multi-effects, but you don't want to spend the big money on the new fancy stuff. This is kind of proof positive that if the session guys from LA, like Tim Pierce, to Nashville, like Tom Bukovac, Jerry McPherson, Derek Wells, Kenny Greenberg, are all still using this device, I think it is proof that it is just as viable now as it was 20 years ago, and the sounds are still just as great as anything else that's out there, and you don't have to spend an arm and a leg to get these. These are not made anymore, but I know that you can still get them new, and they're very, very inexpensive relative to the other multi-effects that are out, so I highly recommend you check out the M9. I also highly recommend that you check out Uncle Larry, aka Tom Bukovac. He's got a wonderful YouTube channel, and he talks about a lot of stuff like this and some of the gear that he uses, and also gives advice to players just like you and me on how to get better tone and things like that. So do check him out. And thank you very much to Tom for helping me evangelize the M9. It's such a great effect. It's so underrated. It sounds so good, as you could hear here, even with mediocre guitar playing kind of going through it. I still think it's very, very beautiful sounding, and I'd kind of forgotten how great it actually was. I really appreciated this opportunity to get a chance to sort of revisit it and get the feel for what it really does and how wonderful it actually is in the context of a nice clean amp going in front of that, stacking some other pedals with it. It's almost unbeatable, frankly, for the price that it is. So thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw today, I definitely recommend that you give us a thumbs up. You leave us a comment. Tell me one of your favorite pieces of mediocre guitar playing that I demoed with the Line 6 M9. I'd love to hear from you on that. Tell me anything you had as far as a takeaway from Tom Bukovac, who is one of our guests for the episode today. And tell me anything that you like to dial up in the M9, maybe some sleeper settings or things like that that you've used on this that you really like. We'd love to compile a list of those in the comments below. And if you want to support us further, you can always head over to the Vertex Effects website, look for one of our authorized dealers to buy one of our pedals to help support us that way. Or you can head over to our podcast, which is a free way to engage with us. And we have a brand new podcast series called The Chairman of the Boards, where me, Brian O'Million, and Grant from Goodwood Audio are all getting together, 3 pedal board builders, and talking about the best practices for rig building, advice, tricks, and tips. So definitely do check that out as well. And if you want to get some services from us, like consultations and things like that about your rig, you can always head over to therigdr.com, where we have all different consulting services that are available for you. You can check those out. You can get a one-on-one consult with me on Zoom, so we can talk specifically about your rig if you'd like. And until next time, I'm Mason Marangella, aka The Rig Doctor. This was all about the Line 6 M9 and why it is still as great of a multi-effects pedal from 20 years ago as it is today, and why you should definitely check one out and get one if you don't have one already. Thanks a lot, guys. See ya.